And so I'm very pleased that the College of Arts and Sciences has recognized her with this semester's Dean's Lecture Award. Now I'll turn the stage over to Professor Tina Escaja. Her remarks today are entitled "The Printer at the Far End of Romance Languages, a CyberArtist Feminist Impostor's Take on Otherness."
What does it mean to be a woman in American academia? What does it mean to be a short, thick-accented, brown, technically Caucasian, I'm from Spain, perceived and felt as Latina, check my name, coming from the working class, keeping that in my skin, in my movements, in my family overseas, being the first generation of everything, high school, college, doctorate, traveler, far beyond, feeling exiled, displaced, working at the far end of the Romance languages department. That is what my laptop computer informs me when trying to print a document, a poem, a recommendation, an article for a book, a manuscript. You have to choose either the printer at the far end, that means across from my door, or the main printer, which happens to be at the other end of the department's corridor, further from my reach. But technology proves me wrong. Despite appearances, I am located at the far end. In a definitely benign mode, this apparent misrecognition reproduces what Iris Zavala calls the anatropic eye, referring to the modern observer colonial or post-colonial. That is, the necessary inversions of values from this side that have served the dominant discourse, so the colonized becomes the subject, not the object, the definer, not the defined, turning, as Zavala states, the European world upside down, the hero becoming the tyrant, the dashing soldier its opposite. An obsession for tone of the 19th century Latin America, struggling to define its brand new nationalities, seen upside down, optics as metaphor. But the turning of values can also transform the victim into oppressor. The whole ideology of emancipation and liberation did not recognize women's emancipation as part of its agenda. Quite the contrary. The oppression of women in our traditional subservient role was at the core of the new agenda, neutralized by the masculine universal hombre, man, making women invisible, not worthy of naming, and literally out of the picture, as subjects at least. In Latin America or elsewhere, think, for example, romanticized concepts such universal suffrage, liberty, equality, fraternity. When I first learned about these notions, I assumed women were part of these ideologies of liberation. After all, women appeared carrying the flag of freedom in the front line of the battle, naked breast and all. Nobody told me that women were not included. Universal suffrage was referring exclusively to white men. How will I know? Universal freedom? The same in Latin America. And yet, the irony is that many of the definers of the new America, meaning Latin America, as we say from this side of the Rio Grande, were perceived and viciously rejected as decadents. Such was the fate of a generation of Latin American writers and ideologists who formed a most exciting and emancipated, rebellious literary movement called Modernismo. Modernismo is an original literary Latin American movement that should not be confused with the English modernism. It is something completely different, so I will keep the Spanish word to emphasize my reference. Modernismo is a turn of the 19th into the 20th century movement, highly sophisticated in form and content. Its practitioners were also perceived as cosmopolitan and refined, escapism having been unfairly read as one of its main modes. Women appeared often in poems by Rubén Darío, Julián del Casal, Julio Herrera Iglesias, Roberto de las Carreras, and many others. As part of this ideology of exoticism, as pure objects of erotic raptures and visual undulating style in tune with the art of the period. And yet, these very same authors were disqualified for not being manly enough, accused of the disease of decadence. Being decadent, that is, feminine, suspiciously fake, homosexual. An example of this judgment is recounted by the critic Richard Carwell. According to Carwell, when comparing modernistas with the Spanish contemporaries, the so-called 1908 generation, renowned intellectuals such as Ángel Balbuena Prat and Pedro Salinas argued that, and I quote my own translation, the 1908 generation is healthy, normal, and masculine. The effeminate modernistas suffer a morbid condition. In a moment described by Elaine Showalter as an age of sexual anarchy, Latin American modernistas were often perceived as decadents. Decadents, also called dandies, were in this period vilified or even prosecuted in Europe, as in the case of the famous trial of Oscar Wilde. Along with the common vilification of the decadent, another new entity considered as well unnatural came up as target of hostility, the woman fighting for suffrage, I mean a more inclusive universal suffrage. The woman altering, challenging conventional roles, the so-called new woman. As Friedrich Nietzsche presents it, quote, women have always conspired with the types of decadence. Nietzsche, decadent despite himself, as Charles Benheimer points out, considered that decadence and women were repugnant, immoral, and pathologically weak. But instead of creating an alliance between these two groups, since, according to Elaine Showalter, quote, both were challenging the institution of marriage and blurring the borders between the sexes, end quote, decadence viciously attacked women in general and the new woman in particular. These are there are myriad of examples of misogyny openly expressed by intellectuals and artists of the period, many of whom were also considered and vilified as decadents. Here are just a few. Woman is the opposite of the dandy, therefore she is horrifying. Woman is hungry and wants to eat. Thirsty, she wants to drink. She's in heat and wants to be fucked. Deserves it. Woman is natural, which is to say, abominable. Also, she's always vulgar, which is to say, the opposite of the dandy. This is from Charles Baudelaire. From the painter Pierre-Auguste Renoir, I consider women writers, lawyers, and politicians such as George Sand, Madame, and other wars as monsters and nothing but five-legged calves. The woman artist is merely ridiculous. The best example, the most recognized modernista writer, Rubén Darío. I have in front of me several photographs of those politicized women. As you will imagine, they are all ugly. Most are obese. Those manly women, let us soften the word, who believe themselves suitable for the public farces in which men excel, and those who, like that Durand woman, step forward to take part in the electoral comedy, deserve punishment. In opposition to the traditional association of women with nature and reproduction, with useful domesticity, the dandy proclaimed artifice, sterility, exoticism, and freedom from usefulness. At the same time, the new woman, who departed from the traditional archetype, was vilified by the decadence. These contradictions are at the core of a semantic of equivalence that unites decadence and the new woman despite everything. And I have several terms of equivalence. I'm just going to mention a couple, like, for example, aberration. For her association with nature, decadence considered women abominable, aberrant. For departing from this role, the new woman was perceived, like dandies were, as the prototype of degeneration. Another one will be malditismo, and I don't really know how to translate it. It's like the accursed poet, writer. Deviation, aberration, social criticism, and antisocial practices signal the accursed writer, le poète maudit. The same could be said about the new woman. In fact, these assumed faults are even greater with the later, since she is vilified by both the social establishment and by the decadent intellectual who finds her ridiculous, a monster, as her behavior was considered repugnant to the natural condition of all women.